So One Book is a community-wide program that we've enjoyed for many years, and the success relies on contributions and collaborations from many, many people. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge those who have made this year's program possible. First of all, the One Book One Broomfield Steering Committee, and as I say your names, if you are here tonight, please stand. Council Member Deven Shaff, sorry, the authors get me. Jane Froman, Diane Carroll, Carrie Pettis, Jan Kardatsky, Kathleen Musri, Mila Stroka, Linda Rodriguez, and Irene Roberts. In addition to the committee's support was received for this year's event from the Broomfield Library Friends Foundation, Broomfield Department of Health and Human Services, Broomfield Enterprise, the Broomfielder, Book Bar, who's here tonight to sell books afterwards, and all of our volunteers who have assisted. In addition to that, out in the lobby, Communities That Care, Youth for Youth, and Community Reach Center are all here with informational tables. So if you're interested afterwards, stop by and talk to them and see what they are doing in our community. None of this would be possible without the talented and hardworking city and county staff throughout the city and county of Broomfield. This year in particular was a real collaborative effort between public health, library and cultural affairs department, and communications department. And a special thanks and round of applause for the mastermind of all of it, Esther Knox-Stutzman. And one quick note, following tonight's presentation, there will be time for questions, and there are mics at both sides, so we can line up and ask the author some questions. In addition to that, there will be a book signing, and he'll come out and be able to talk to you. We have some room for those, if there's anyone still left in the overflow room, to come on down. So now it's my great privilege to introduce Council Member Deven Sheff, who will say a few words and introduce our author.
Good evening, Broomfield. I'm one of your Broomfield City Council members, Deven Sheff, which is different than David Sheff. David Sheff, just don't get us mixed up. On behalf of the City and County of Broomfield, I welcome you to the 14th One Book One Broomfield program. The 29th selection is Beautiful Boy by David Sheff, a gripping memoir which explores issues of substance abuse, fatherhood, and family. David Sheff has become an expert and advocate on the United States drug crisis and the prevention and treatment of addiction. Beautiful Boy was a #1 New York Times bestseller, was named the year's best nonfiction book by Entertainment Weekly, and Amazon Best Books of 2008, and won first place in the Barnes & Noble Discover Award in nonfiction. It is my pleasure to present David Sheff.
I'm the real Deven Sheff. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be here. As your mayor said in the film, people do love coming to Broomfield, and I do. It's a remarkable community, and evidence of the fact that of what a remarkable community is the fact that you are coming together tonight to talk about what I consider the most pressing domestic crisis that we're facing. I'm reminded all the time about the ubiquity of the crisis that we're in, how many people are suffering. There are dramatic stories that I hear every single day. I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey that brought me here. I was reminded recently about sort of when we live with this every single day, and yet when we are dealing with almost anything else in our lives, when we're dealing with the sickness in our family, when we're dealing with crises related to our work, to our other things, it's something that we share with our neighbors and we talk about. But because of the stigma that comes with addiction and related mental illnesses, it's something that we don't talk about. And when we don't talk about something, we feel like we're alone. We feel like we're the only ones suffering. And when we open up and when we start to share our stories, we realize that we aren't, that we're all in this together. The other night I was reminded, beautiful boy came out, and my son Nick, who I'll talk about Nick in a minute, but anyway, he wrote a memoir and they made a movie based on both of our books, and it came out last year. It was called Beautiful Boy. And basically it was about our family's journey when my son became addicted to methamphetamine and heroin and other drugs. And the movie came out, and my daughter, Daisy, who in the movie is this tiny little blonde-haired girl, and now she's big, and she never was blonde, but she was at an art opening. And she was standing in a circle at an art gallery opening in San Francisco, and she was with one of her favorite artists was standing there, and then one of the curators from the museum, all these sort of fancy people, and so she was really kind of nervous and shy. And somebody in that group of people in that circle said, just randomly said, "Oh man, I saw this really intense movie last night, Beautiful Boy. It's about this family dealing with addiction." And somebody else said, "Yeah, oh God, I saw that too. That was so intense." And so they're talking about the movie, and Daisy is sitting there thinking, should I say anything? Would it be too weird if I said something? Would it be too weird if I didn't say something? So finally, she screwed up the courage and said, in a very quiet voice, she said, "Yeah, that movie is about my family." And the artist, that she was enamored of, looked over at her and she goes, "I know, it's about my family too." And then with the other ones, it was about my family too. And that's the truth. That is what's happening. We are, there's a man I know, and he talks about what happened in his family, and he had a child who got cancer, and of course that was terrible. And when that happened, their community rallied around his family, and they brought casseroles, and they offered support, and they offered to drive them to the doctor, take care, babysit the other kids. Their son ended up fine. He ended up going into remission, and he was fine. Then they had a younger child. Their younger child, as he grew older, he became addicted. He became addicted to pain pills and then heroin. And he said that people were not bringing by casseroles. People were not offering to help and offering their support. And it was because, he said, it wasn't even a judgment of the other people. He said it was a judgment of himself. He said, because we live with this shame, with this stigma, where we feel that people who become addicted are somehow morally bereft. They are selfish. They lack willpower. And their families, there must be something terribly wrong with their families. When my son finally became addicted, I didn't tell anybody for a long time. And I didn't tell anybody because I was ashamed. I didn't want people to judge Nick, and I didn't want people to judge me. What did it mean, that my son was a drug addict? I must be a terrible father. It really started about 20 years ago, at a time when the drug problem in America was dramatic. That year, about 30,000 people died of overdose. And I couldn't imagine things getting worse. But of course they have. We all know. It's happened throughout our country, and it also has happened, of course, in Colorado, in this area. Drug use, overdose deaths, suicide, all the related problems are escalating. Last year, across America, 72,000 people died of overdose. That's more people are dying today of drug overdose than anything else. More people under 50 are dying of drug overdose than anything else. It's inconceivable. It's such a hard fact to fathom, and that we're losing 200 people every single day. And I hear these statistics, and we read them in the newspaper, and they're on the radio, and they're on television. But the problem with statistics is that they dehumanize the drug problem, because numbers cannot communicate the suffering. Every one of those numbers, every statistic is a person, and every person is a family. I'm reminded of the pain of addiction every single day when I receive letters from people or I meet people. I get messages, private messages on social media, and they are telling me their stories. One thing I learned is that because of the shame, we don't talk about what we're going through. When we do open up, when we do talk, we learn that we aren't alone, and we learn how many people are suffering. And because I chose to go forward and to write about our family's experience, and then I wrote this book, and Nick wrote a book, and then they made a movie, people are reaching out all the time. And I open my computer in the morning or look at my phone with this trepidation. My heart is beating because I was going to say I don't know what is in store for me, but the truth is I do know what is in store. And what is in store, it's letter after letter after letter from people who either want to tell me what they've gone through. Their journey has been like mine. Their family is like my family. They sometimes are calling, they're writing to ask questions. They send private messages on social media. Sometimes they send letters to, whatever, my agent, and they forward them to me. And I open up these envelopes and photographs fall out. People are showing me pictures of their children who've died. When I email messages, attach more photographs. Every day I'm reminded of what we are living with and what we're facing. A father wrote me about his daughter. She was so smart and kind and loving. She was 15. She was using marijuana and drinking. Then she was given OxyContin. That's when I lost her. We got her into rehab, and she was clean for a few months, but then she relapsed. She was at a park when they found her. I can hardly write these words. We lost our beautiful girl. Another letter from another father. Dear Mr. Sheff, I don't know where to begin, so I'll begin last Saturday night when a police officer showed up at our house and told me that my son is dead. He took an overdose of pills. He was our only child whom we loved more than life, and he's gone forever. My hands are shaking as I write. I cannot stop the tears. I don't know if I can survive the loss of my beautiful boy. Letter after letter, family after family, child after child. A few years ago, I never could have imagined that I would be here talking to you about this subject. I never could have imagined that I would go forward and write about addiction, because it was not something that was on my radar at all. I wasn't naive about drugs. I did drugs when I was a kid. I had a college roommate who had drug problems and ended up overdosing and dying. I didn't know he was a drug addict. I mean, looking back, I do. But it was not something in my consciousness, as it isn't in most people's consciousness. It certainly hasn't been. I had this image of what a drug addict looks like, and it's the person I would see when I would walk down certain neighborhoods in San Francisco or New York or in Denver. I mean, I know it's everywhere. And you see people in doorways, probably homeless, in some cases obviously psychotic high. We avert our eyes, we cross the street when we pass by. That's what a drug addict looks like as far as I was concerned. They didn't look like my child. What I now know is that people who become addicted look like all of us and all of our children. And now when I walk down those same streets, I don't avert my eyes. I look at those people. And my heart breaks for them. I realize that they're ill, and I realize that every one of them is someone's child, and I wonder about their parents. Our story began just like so many other families. I had this lovely child. He was my firstborn son. I was thrilled to become a father, and my life revolved around him. I mean, I'm his dad, but a little prejudiced, but he was amazing. I mean, he's just an amazing kid. And as he was growing up, I tried to do what I could to be the best dad I could, to be the best father, and I tried to be responsible. We're living in a culture where there are all these challenges, and one of them that we all know about is the prevalence of drugs. We know that drugs are there. We know kids are going to have to confront them at some point. So I did what I thought was the responsible thing to do, and I talked to my son as he grew older. And I thought, we had a very, very close relationship. I knew we talked about everything, I thought. And so when he was 11 years old and I was getting him ready, he was going to go spend the night at a friend's house, and I was getting his sweater from his backpack or something like that, I was stunned to find a bag of marijuana in his backpack. And I was stunned for two reasons. One of them is that I just didn't know. As I said, I thought I knew what was going on in his life. I knew his friends. I thought I knew. And there was a whole part I realized of him that I didn't know about. And the other part was that it just broke my heart because he was so young. He was 11 years old. I did what I thought the responsible parent would do, and I went to his school, and I talked to his teacher, and his teacher brought in a counselor. My wife, Karen, and I sat with them and told them about our concerns, and they told me exactly what I wanted to hear. They said, oh, listen, drugs are out there, kids are experimenting, it's a rite of passage. Nick's a great kid, he's really smart, he's a good student, he's got a lot of friends. Don't worry, Nick will be fine. And that's what I wanted to hear. That's not what I wish they had said to me, and that's not what they should have said to me. It's not their fault, they didn't know, but what they should have said, I learned that there are all these risk factors that tell us everyone has the potential to become addicted, any person. But there are some people who are more likely to become addicted, and there's a whole range of risk factors. I'll talk about them a little bit. But one of them is the age of first use. We know that the younger a person is who tries drugs, the more likely they will have drug problems, become addicted. So what they should have told me is what's going on in this life of this 11-year-old child who is already getting high. Let's figure out what's going on and let's do what we can to help him. But instead they told me that he would be fine, and of course he wasn't. His drug use escalated. I didn't know most of what happened because he was really good at showing me what I wanted to see. I think parents have a tendency to look at the outsides of our children, to look at these external barometers to tell us how our kids are doing. We're so desperate for them to be good students and for them to have good friends and to be, filling out their resumes when they're, 12 years old, being in the school play and being great in sports and all those things. And according to all those external barometers, Nick was doing great. So that's what I saw. And when I look back and realize that there were actually really dramatic warning signs that he wasn't okay, I'm appalled, really, at myself for seeing what I wanted to see and not seeing the truth. Because again, who knows? But if I had learned how to pay attention in a different way, it might have made an enormous difference. I'm not saying that to beat myself up, I didn't know. But the point about it is that when we're talking about these numbers, those statistics that I listed, we have a crisis here, and there is an assumption that we have this crisis and it has been created from outside of us and there's nothing we can do about it. We have to live with it. We have these deaths. It's tragic. We have to just resign ourselves. But the truth is that we don't. There is a lot we know about how to prevent drug use, even though we haven't been doing it. And we know how to treat people who become addicted, even though we haven't been successfully doing that either. One of them is education. One of them is knowledge, so that we can help parents like me, teachers, other people who are seeing our children on the front lines, really, the ones who are in a position to recognize problems that may relate to drugs themselves, early drug use, or maybe other things that can relate to drug use, other psychological problems, struggling in school, problems with their friends, things like that. But I didn't see it. And I was in denial, and I went forward, and I saw what I wanted to see, until one Friday night, Nick went out with his friends, and he was older then, and he was supposed to be home at 11 o'clock at night, and he didn't show up. And so I got angry. I'm going to ground him, and then it was midnight, and I started to get worried. And then it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and I got on the phone and I called his friends' homes and woke up the parents, and nobody had seen Nick. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and my wife, Karen got up with me, and just terror. Where was Nick? I called the police to see if there'd been an accident. I called our local hospital, the emergency room, and no one had seen him. We suffered through the entire night. Any parent who's been there knows what it's like to have a child out there somewhere and not know. Our mind goes to the worst places possible. I expected the phone to ring, and I expected the phone to ring, give me the worst news of all, that my son had died. The morning came, no sign of Nick. Our younger children, Daisy and Jasper, came running into the kitchen ready to start their day, and they looked at their mom and dad, and they could see that something was terribly wrong. And Jasper said, "Where's Nick?" He knew. And of course the answer was that we didn't know. And we had to endure that full day, another night, more and more phone calls to the police, to the hospitals, everyone I could think of. I made those calls over and over again. One time I called our local sheriff's office, and I called so often that the dispatcher knew me and said, "Oh, well, Mr. Sheff, have you tried the morgue?" I didn't hear from Nick for that second day, and another night, excruciating, overwhelming, terrifying. And then finally on that third day, the phone rang and my heart stopped, and I picked up the phone, and yes, indeed, it was Nick, and my first reaction was to sigh a breath of relief because I knew he was alive. But he sounded terrible, and he told me where he was, and so I went to where he was near us, and when I saw him, no more denial. He almost died, and I could see that. He was emaciated, and he was trembling, and he could barely stand up. So I got him in the car, I brought him home, and I put him in his room, and he fell asleep, and then I got on the phone and had to figure out what to do. And that was when I realized for the first time that we have, we call it an addiction care system in our country, but it's not a system, it's a broken system, if anything, and it's broken because it is based on a time when we considered drug use to be this sign of a person who was sort of the same thing as before, this person who somehow lacked willpower, who somehow was morally deficient. And we did not treat people who were addicted in the way that we treated people with any other disease. If my son had any other disease, I would have known what to do. I would have called our doctor, and I would have probably brought him in to see the doctor. He would have had a checkup. If tests were required, the doctor would have ordered tests. If we needed a second opinion, we would have gone to a specialist. I called our local doctor, and he didn't know what to tell me. There was a survey done recently of pediatricians, even now, when we're in the middle of this crisis, a survey done of our pediatricians across the country, and only 1 out of 10 was able to recognize a drug problem in one of their patients. Now, we bring our children to our pediatricians to help us keep them safe, to help them grow up healthily. What about their mental health? We bring them for physicals every year. What about mental health checkups? It's not the pediatricians' faults either. I'm not blaming them or anybody. They're not trained. There was just a survey done by the American Society of Addiction Medicine that showed that in the top, I think it was 80 medical schools across this country, the average training in addiction for future doctors is 1 hour. That's the average. Many people graduate, become doctors of every kind, and they have never been trained to recognize addiction and never been trained to intervene when somebody has a drug problem or is addicted. So my doctor didn't know what to tell me. People told me, somebody told me they knew somebody. I called the school. Finally, I found some mom, and she told me for the first time, she said, this is the first time I heard it, she said that her son was addicted to drugs, very similar story to Nick, same age, And what she learned is that you can't help somebody who has a drug problem. You have to essentially shun them, let them hit bottom. That's what they said. You have to let them hit bottom. You can't help them. If you do, you're enabling them. You have to practice tough love. To me, she told me that I had to just send him out of the house and let him figure it out. And I just got him home. He almost died. I'm supposed to kick him out. I cannot tell you how many times in those letters, those communications I get from people who tell me that they have gotten that message, same message that I got. If you help somebody who is addicted, you are worsening their problem, you are enabling their problem, they have to hit bottom. What we know is when somebody is ill, the last thing we want them to do is hit bottom. Their condition gets worse, more debilitation, more consequences of their addiction, harder to treat, and much more likelihood, of course, that there will be a catastrophe, including that they will die. And yet, we are told over and over again, you can't help them, you have to let them hit bottom. A dad wrote to me many, many letters like this, but a father wrote to me very, very recently, and he said, I got that message over and over again. And my son called, and I told him what they told me to tell him, which was that get help, you know what to do, call me when you're sober. I hung up the phone. And he said the next day, a police officer showed up at our house and told me that my son had died. Was my love tough enough? Did he finally hit his bottom? It is a dangerous message. It doesn't mean that it's black and white and we keep our doors open and we give our children money if they're using drugs. I mean, there's a lot of subtlety in that. But this idea that we want people to get so bad that they are desperate, that they are near death before they can get help for this problem, it's wrong. It's not true. And second of all, it's incredibly dangerous. But that's what people told me. People told me to send them to boot camp, as if sending this child who is sick off to the desert to march in this 100-degree Arizona sun or something like that is going to help. But I had to do something. I didn't know what to do. Finally, some mom told me about a treatment program, a rehab that she had sent her son to, and it had helped. So I called them up, and they took our insurance, and they had a bed, and I brought Nick there. And I dropped him off. He didn't want to go. He was terrified. He was crying. He told me that he'd made a mistake. He would never do it again. I wanted to believe him, but I was too scared. And so I left him there. I got in the car and I cried, but I felt some relief in knowing where he was and in the belief that I would pick him up in a month. It was a month-long residential program. I'd pick him up in a month and he'd be fine. He'd be cured. And then he'd go out. That was the time he was getting ready to go to college. He'd go off to college, and we would go back to the life that I had planned for him and that he envisioned for himself. But of course, that's not what happened. He went through the month-long program. He was doing great by the time it was over. He was determined that he was going to stay sober. And 3 days later, he disappeared again. So I had another one of those nights of no sleep and of worry and the phone calls to the police and also getting those phone calls, phone ringing in the middle of the night, a hospital emergency room, doctor calling me to tell me, Mr. Sheff, we have your son. You'd better get down here. We don't know if he's going to make it. Another time an emergency room doctor called and told me that they had Nick and that they were going to have to amputate his arm because it had become infected because he was injecting drugs with a needle. And I, as horrified as I was about everything else that would happen, somehow that was something that was a new horror for me. I thought of my child who I would sit on the floor with and play Legos, and we would build castles, and if he would fall asleep in the car, I would pick him up and he'd wrap his arms around me, and these were the same arms he was injecting poison into. Every time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Nick would go out. his drug use escalated. He got in more and more trouble. He was arrested. He had these crises in hospital emergency rooms, overdoses, fights. I mean, all kinds of other things that would happen. Somehow I would find him. I would get him back into treatment. He would do fine for a while he was there. He would leave and he would relapse over and over and over again. And this happened over years. After about 8 treatment programs, some at first our insurance helped pay for some. Some of them were very expensive. I found some that weren't, some that had sliding scales. But at the end, I actually was bargaining with these treatment programs to allow me to pay them off in installments because I was so desperate. I needed to get Nick help. I needed to get him safe. I didn't know what else to do. So I got him into these programs. And eventually, there was a program after programs that I look back on and realize it's not that they were useless, because one of the things they did was they got him in a place that was safe. And they did educate him. They started to educate him about addiction. But he never got the kind of treatment that he needed by people who were trained in addiction medicine. Finally, he got that. And he was in a program that was for longer. It was a 3-month, a 90-day program. Another thing that research has showed us, that that's the minimum amount of time that someone needs treatment if we're going to expect that they're going to stay sober after treatment. That's the minimum. So Nick got out of that program, and he stayed sober for a month, and then 2 months, and then 3 months, and then it was 6 months, and it felt like a miracle that he made it to 6 months, and then he made it to a year. And part of the reason that I love being here is that this was an event that was organized by your library. I love books. I love libraries. I spend so much time in our library in my home. In my community, I always have. And I always aspired to be a writer, and after college, I worked as an editor for a number of years and started writing as a freelancer, and that's what I've done since then. And I always have written about things that I care about, and we had gone through something that was 10 years basically of hell, and when it happened, I was completely blindsided. As I said before, this is not something that could ever happen to me, not to my family, not to my beautiful boy. And so I talked to Nick, I talked to Nick's mom, I talked to my wife, I talked to other people in our family to ask how they would feel about if I went forward to write about what had happened to our family, what we'd experienced, with the idea of telling other people, yes, this can happen to you. Don't do what I did. Don't pretend it's not happening. Recognize the early signs. Get help. So with their support and encouragement, I went forward, and first I wrote an article that appeared in the New York Times Magazine. And when that article came out, that's when everything changed. I said before how ashamed I was and how embarrassed I was, and so I tried to keep the fact that my son was addicted a secret, because I didn't want to be judged. I didn't want him to be judged. And so I didn't get it. I didn't understand how pervasive this is. I didn't understand how many people were affected until that article came out. I got the magazine forwarded me letters. And first there were a couple dozen, and then there were 100, and then there were hundreds. And then eventually, it was my editor at the magazine. You can imagine the New York Times Magazine, they publish things for I don't know how many millions of years, and amazing articles, and they get a lot of reactions. But my editor said that they'd never gotten more letters for anything they'd ever published than for this article. And it's not because of any magic of my writing. It was because I was telling the story that people were living, and that's what the letter said. That's what people wrote to me when they wrote. They said, how did you get into our home? Your story is our story. Your family is my family. And nobody knows. I did not, until I read your article, I didn't know that there was anyone else who was experiencing that anguish, that horror. Because of that reaction, because of a beginning of an understanding of this crazy force that was everywhere and yet we weren't talking about, that's why I decided to go forward and to write Beautiful Boy. And after that, I wrote another book because when Beautiful Boy came out, the sort of door opened even more, and I continued to hear from more people and learn more about the problem and learned more about the suffering. And in the meantime, that coincided with this crisis that we are now in the middle of, a crisis that began with, we're all reading the newspapers about the pharmaceutical companies, the overprescribing of medications, the prescription pills, the opioids that led oftentimes to heroin and other opioids, and now is leading to fentanyl use. In many cases, children are using fentanyl. They don't know they're using it. It's mixed in pills, even sometimes in marijuana. So that the problem has escalated, and I have continued over these years to try to figure out what's going on. The first thing I wanted to do was, why are we losing so many of our loved ones, our lovely children, our lovely husbands and wives and partners and parents and brothers and sisters and other people that we love? So the first thing I wanted to learn about was, what is addiction? What does it mean? What does it mean that a person can do? We are designed as human beings to survive. That's our basic, everything that's inside our heads has developed to help us survive. Yet, a person who becomes addicted, there's a shift inside their brain, so that what they then are doing that makes them believe, that makes them feel as if what they need to do to survive is to continue to take drugs, more drugs, and kill themselves. It's completely counterintuitive, and yet that's what happens to somebody when they become addicted. A person who described it to me in a way that made me see it crystal clear. The feeling of being addicted, the need for drugs. We say craving because that sounds almost like a choice. I want it. It's not want, it's need. The need for drugs is just like the need for other people who are not addicted for oxygen. We need that to breathe. We feel if we're deprived that, we will do whatever we can to get oxygen. We will kick and we will scream and we will whatever. A person who's addicted, that is what's going on in their body, because their brain has gotten to the point where the normal for that brain is the presence of the drugs and of a drug, and whatever, when the drug is when they're deprived of that drug, they feel like they will die, and in some cases they will from withdrawal. So I wanted to understand. It makes no sense. It looks like a choice. Nobody forced my son to go out and get high the first time. I mean, initial drug use obviously is a choice. But we have this idea, when we go back to this idea that people who use are selfish, that they lack willpower, all those kinds of things. The assumption there is that they're out there having fun. They just want to get high. They don't care how it affects us. They don't care how it affects their friends, their siblings. It looks like a choice. No one forced my son to go steal in order to get drugs. So the problem is, initial drug use is a choice, but nobody chooses to become addicted. And when a person is addicted, they are not having fun. They are in hell. They are sick. And they need our help. So I wanted to understand that. I wanted to understand, we have always tried to prevent drug use and prevent addiction, and we've always been trying futilely to treat people who become addicted. So I wanted to understand all I could about that, about all of that. What is addiction? Can we prevent it? Can we treat addiction? There's so much to say about it. I don't want to talk too long because I want to have an opportunity to have a conversation, to hear if anyone has something to share about this, their own experiences or questions. But I guess what I will say very quickly is that the reason we have failed so miserably, the reason so many people are becoming addicted, the reason so many of our children are using drugs, even those who do not become addicted, is because we've been thinking about the problem wrong. We have not understood this problem. We focus so much on drugs, this idea that we can tell our kids to say no to drugs and they're not going to use them. Obviously that doesn't work, or we wouldn't be where we are now. The conversation we have to step back from that and look less at the drugs themselves than to the question of why people use drugs, why our children are using drugs. And the answer is incredibly complicated. Before I talked about the fact that there are risk factors where some people are more likely to become addicted and even use drugs at the beginning. And some of those risk factors are if there's a genetic component, if there's alcoholism, addiction in the family, a person is more likely to use drugs and then to become addicted. We finally found out after Nick was sober, when I wrote the article in the book, and Nick went forward and wrote a book, he relapsed again after that a couple times. Finally, he ended up in the care of a psychiatrist who asked me, could I please see, if I want, this kid's going to die. We have to save his life. What are we going to do? Could I see his psychological tests? And I said, what's that? What's a psychological test? And she said, you mean he has been, this time, after 10 years, he'd been in these treatment programs. He'd seen these so-called specialists over and over again. He'd been in outpatient programs. He'd been in sober living houses that no one had him tested, she said, and of course no one had, and she was appalled, and she had him tested, and it turned out that Nick has very serious mental illnesses. He has bipolar disorder, he has depression, and he has anxiety disorder. And when she recognized that finally, she was able to treat him. And that's the last time he relapsed. That was 9 years ago. A risk factor for, well, thank you. A risk factor, so many of the people who become seriously addicted have a mental illness or another psychological problem that is related to either, as I said, depression, anxiety, something like bipolar disorder. Also people who are struggling in different ways, who've suffered traumas. Those people are much more likely to use drugs and to become addicted. When we understand that there is research that shows us that there is a direct relationship between stress and drug use, we have a course forward. There's a survey of children across the United States, of teenagers. 7,000 kids were surveyed, and the question, they were asked why they use drugs, if they do, or why they think their peers use, and then they asked their parents, they asked adults why kids use drugs. And parents said what I would have said, that the reason that kids use drugs is because it feels good, it's fun, and because of peer pressure. You know, their friends are doing it, and so they don't want to be sort of, you know, out of it or whatever, and so they're using to be cool or whatever. But that's not what the students said. That's not what the teenagers said. The way at the top of the list, the number one reason teenagers said that they use drugs was because of stress. Whether it's stress, whether it's these mental illnesses, whether it is learning disabilities, eating disorders, I mean, all these kinds of things that make life harder for anybody. Those increase the likelihood that someone will become addicted and somebody, so when we understand that we have those risk factors, instead of throwing up our hands and saying there's nothing we can do to prevent drug use, we all of a sudden realize that there is a lot we can do. And that is that we can work, every one of the risk factors can be mitigated, and we have to work to mitigate those risk factors. And a lot of that does have to do with education. It has to do with educating parents, teachers, doctors, as I was talking about, communities coming together so that we can all understand that our children are not being raised in a vacuum. You know, it's a cliche, but it does take a village. Another reason why it's so gratifying that people have come together in your community that involve people from the healthcare field, the addiction-related mental health care, schools, law enforcement, religious organizations. That's what it takes. We all have to learn, first of all, to recognize problems, stresses in our kids' lives, and figure out ways to make life less stressful for kids. Put in place the supports that they need and the supports that their families need. So when we put these in place, we actually will turn the tide because we will prevent people from becoming addicted. And the other thing that we can do, which I won't talk about now because I don't really have time to talk about it, but we also have learned about how we can treat this disease. The 72,000 people that died last year, it is horrifying. But it's even more horrifying because we could have saved those lives if we had given them the treatment that they needed. Right now, the place where we treat most people who are addicted, where most people who are addicted end up in jail. Our jails have become our mental health wards, our addiction treatment centers. Although, of course, no treatment happens usually. Of the people who do get treatment, only 1 in 10 of them get treatment that we consider to be gold standard treatment, state-of-the-art, evidence-based treatment. But we do know how to treat this disease. If anything good will come out of the crisis that we're in now, it is that we are having conversations like this, and there is a groundswell now in communities all around the country, and oftentimes they are started by parents who've lost their kids. That shame I talked about, that feeling of guilt, that feeling of, in the old days, if somebody died, if a child died of an overdose, and if you looked at the obituary in the newspaper, it would never, ever say that. It would always be some other reason that the person died. But parents now, when it's happening so often, are getting together and saying that we will not be silent anymore. I am not going to hide this problem. I am not going to pretend it's not happening. We are going to get together. We're going to work together as a community, and we are going to solve this problem. And it's happening all over the country. And because of that, there is, in communities, groups of parents, mostly parents, other people come in as well, have changed. There's more treatment options because of that. There's more education in schools, more effective education. There's access to Narcan, a medication that can reverse an opioid disorder. There's a lot that's happening, but none of it is going to happen until we start talking about this problem. If we start talking about it not just in this room, but outside this room, where you work, where you go to school, where your kids go to school, where you shop, where you hang out, whatever it is. It is the #1 killer of people under 50 years old. It is killing our children in ways that has never happened before. And we can end this crisis when we start to talk about it. And what happens is, shame goes away when we start to tell our stories. We open up and we realize that we are not alone. When Daisy and Jasper were little, when Nick was on the streets one of the times, I was at a swim meet. Daisy and Jasper were swimming, and in the meantime, I didn't know where Nick was. He was out there somewhere, and I knew that he could be dead. So the parents were cheering on the kids, and they were talking about where their kids were going to college or what play they were in, and all these, all their great accomplishments. And I was pretending. Go angry tuna, that's what they were called. But I was dying inside because I didn't know where my son was. Eventually, when I did decide to write that article, a friend of mine was a journalist, and she read the article first. I asked her to read it. And she was also a parent in that school, in the Daisy and Jasper school, and she called me up and said, "You cannot publish this. People in our community will look at you differently. They know Nick, they know Daisy and Jasper's big brother. They're not going to let their kids come over to your house if they know that your son is a drug addict." But I decided to go ahead and publish it. And what happened was there was no judgment whatsoever. It was the opposite. The same people who were sitting next to me at the swim meet, who were, in my view, they looked like they had no problems in their lives. I was sitting there dying. They told me, a mom grabbed me and she pulled me in at the school. She pulled me around a corner and she said, I grew up with an alcoholic father, and I just found my 8th grade son. I found marijuana in his room, and I'm terrified he's going to become just like my father. A dad told me it wasn't just about drugs, it was about all kinds of things. A father told me that his child had an eating disorder and was in a clinic for treatment, but he told all the other families that his daughter was in a study abroad program, as if there was this great shame in having a child that's ill. So Andy Lamont, the writer, who's, she's one of my neighbors, she says that we increase our pain because we compare our insides with other people's outsides. It seems like everybody else is doing great. Their kids are all sailing through, but the truth is that no one sails through. Life is really, really hard. And when we open up, when we share our stories, we realize, first of all, that we're not alone. and we aren't. And we can help each other, we can support each other, and that is how we are going to turn the tide on this crisis that we're in the middle of now. So thank you for having me here. Thanks for being here. And I think now there's an opportunity if anyone has any questions or anything to say. There are these microphones on the sides. And thank you.
Hi, is this too loud? Or can you hear me? Yesterday, my son turned 40, and like you, I celebrated when he got to be 21. Knowing what you do now, what would you have done differently as far as putting him to rehab, or how would you reacted when he was in his teens?
Well, the first thing is that if I knew what I know now, I mean, I guess the biggest thing would be I talked about seeing what I wanted to see, not what was going on. I mean, I would have known. A pediatrician said to me, you know, if you think there's a problem, there's a problem. So there was a lot of times looking back that I realized there was a problem, but I didn't want to see it. So I would have tried to get help right away. But the other thing is, the big piece, of course, is that now that I know that Nick actually had depression and anxiety disorder, if I had known that when he was a child, if I'd been able to find a therapist or somebody who could have recognized that and begun treatment for it then, who knows what would have happened. But I think that's one of the ways that we arm ourselves, all of us, which is that we understand that these risk factors and we educate ourselves and educate each other so that we can recognize problems, not just early stages of drug use, but you know, what if you have a child who really seems sad a lot? Well, everybody has to feel sad sometimes, and it's a good thing for kids to experience and to know what that feels like. But what's the difference between a child who is sad and one who might have depression? We don't know. We're parents. That's not our job. Parents somehow have to be everything for our kids. We have to be their nutritionists, their coaches, their homework assistant, whatever, and everything, and their doctors and diagnose their problems. But we can't. So that's when, if there's a question, is it sadness or is maybe something else going on? That's the time to go to get help and to see a professional. We have to rely on each other again and not pretend that we can do it ourselves. So I guess I would go get help right away. And people who told me that everything's fine, that it's a rite of passage, it's normal not to worry about it, I would have known not to listen to them.
Hi.
Hi.
My main thing that I resonated with you, and my main question is, you mentioned that you talked to Nick about drugs and your drug use, and then you thought maybe later that was a mistake because you're fine. My concern is my sister was addicted to meth for many years, and then she went to pot, and then her husband went to pot, and my dad's an alcoholic, and I have 2 nieces that are 7 and 4. And so my concern is, do we tell them about their past history? Do we not tell them about their past history? Do we just watch for signs? Because it's like, that's a real fear point for me.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's no magic answers to any of this. Every person is different. Every child is different. Every family is different. But no, I think they need to know. They're going to learn from somebody. They're going to start hearing from somebody about this thing out there that's going on. They hear, even when they're very young, they hear from older kids, their friends, big brothers and sisters. And the other thing is that if people have addiction in their family, they are more at risk. They're at a higher risk. And so in very gentle, age-appropriate ways, they have to start to be educated about the fact that they are at a higher risk. And so when they are at an age when they're going to have to start navigating that world and making decisions, they need to be empowered with as much information as they can. And at the same time, as we have to look out for them and look for signs and look for these early signs and intervene. And the other thing is, the first thing I said is that every family is different. And again, this idea that there's sort of some manual that tells us what to do that applies to every family, it just doesn't exist. And so that is another conversation that I think sometimes families need to have, certainly among themselves, and sometimes maybe in the presence of a therapist, to try to figure this out. I mean, the family, like, it sounds like there's been a lot of trauma in that family. And whether the kids know the details or not, that is part of that family now. And so maybe that's, this, I'm not singling out, family, but any family, it's stuff that, if we pretend it's not happening, if we ignore it and expect it to go away, it probably won't.
Hi, thank you for sharing your story.
Thanks.
I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but my statement is, I wholeheartedly agree with you that there is almost always some underlying why. Why does someone want to start using drugs? So my son started at age 15, and I tried very hard to understand the why, because I did believe that if I knew that, I could help him. And I learned that in the state of Colorado, the age of consent is 15 for treatment. I could not force him to go to therapy. I could not force him to go to his doctor. I could not force him to go to rehab. I could not make him do anything, because the state of Colorado believes that once they turn 15, they have full control over their bodies and minds. And if you're in this room and you don't know that, you should know that. So Colorado's not the only state that has 15 as the age of consent. So what are we to do as parents when we see a problem and we cannot do anything?
The age of consent should be maybe 40, I think. It's appalling. I mean, 15 is even more appalling than 18, which is what it is where I am, and it is. You're expecting a person, first of all, who isn't mature enough, even without drugs, to be able to make choices and make decisions. But then you throw drugs into the mix. It's appalling. So I think one of the things has to do with fighting those laws. I mean, it's about policy, and there are people in certain states who, I'm trying to remember, I think it may be Ohio or Pennsylvania, parents had a situation that was it was different, but they had a child who was over 18, was in a treatment program, left the treatment program, went out, overdosed, and died, and the parents thought the child was in the treatment program, but because of the law that they couldn't tell the parents because of HIPAA, they didn't even know, they thought their kid was safe, and they've sued, and they're making progress. And so whether it's lawsuits, whether it's lobbying politicians, it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. Then the other thing is, so if this is what you are dealing with, what do you do? There are interventions that trained therapists know how to help get somebody who is resistant to treatment, a child who doesn't believe they have a problem, who's angry, who's belligerent, who might, I heard it all, you're trying to control me, I'm just having fun, or I can kill myself if I want. I mean, all the things that Nick said at different periods of time. Short of, I guess, breaking the law and grabbing him and putting him somewhere, which I guess it's breaking the law. It's probably not a very good idea for a lot of other reasons as well. But working with a therapist in something, for instance, is something called CRAFT. There are therapists that are community reinforcement and blah, blah, I don't know. It's online. And family training. Working with a counselor, meet with a counselor, explain what's going on, work for a while with the counselor and figuring out a way to bring your child in. You still, even if you don't have the legal authority to make a child do certain things, you certainly have a lot of, we have a lot of authority anyway with our kids, at least to a certain point, a certain extent. And then in the hands of a good therapist, work together, help. It's not about blame. It's not about, you're the one with a problem. It's like, we are a family. We're going to figure out what's going on together. Let's figure out what's going to happen next. And that's effective, and it's been shown to be effective. And there are other ways. And there are books about it or pamphlets about it online. So you can try it, families can try it themselves. But a lot of times from what I hear, people do need help, and to find a therapist who knows how to do that, that's one thing. So, but the other thing is everybody should be, these are the kinds of ludicrous, well-meaning, I guess 15 is nuts. To me, it makes no sense. Kids' brains are developing their adolescence until they're at least about 25. And so we want to have a 15-year-old be able to make decisions for themselves. It makes no sense. What can I say? I think, talk to your mayors. There's 2 here. Ask them what to do.
I'm going to try to get through this. I was a person that was addicted to heroin and methamphetamine. And I was addicted to those drugs for roughly 6 years of my life because of being overprescribed by a doctor during a surgery. I randomly picked up your son Nick's book. And I can't tell you how many times I've read it. And I hoped and I prayed that at some point I would be able to thank him, because your son saved my life and you saved my dad's. I gave him your book, Beautiful Boy, the morning I went to treatment. And this past July, I was fortunate enough to celebrate 4 years clean. The work you do is it's not good, it's not valuable, it is necessary because we're losing so many people. But to the moms, to the dads, to the other people in this room that are in recovery, don't give up. Do what he did. I had to go to jail in order to stop. But the hope that your son gave me in his writings, and the hope that you gave my father to be able to continue living his life and be happy, that's a godsend. So I'm going to ask you for a favor. My sponsor gave me this. It's my 4-year coin, and if you could tell Nick that I truly do owe him my life, and that just for today, we can continue doing what we're doing, and you can continue advocating for what is so necessary, then we can continue to help save people.
Oh, thank you. It's all about sharing our stories and coming together. And nobody has ever said it better. Just don't give up. So thank you for coming again tonight. I'm going to be here out in the lobby in a little while if anybody wants to talk some more. But thank you.